This happened when I was 11. My brothers and I had not long started at our new school. 3 days a week, Mom would drop us off, and the other 2, we had to catch the bus. This day, Mom dropped us off. As soon as she pulled up, I spotted a man standing at the only gate into the school. Apparently, no one thought that was creepy. I begged Mom to drop us off out back, but she was running late for work and wouldn't listen. I waited for Mom to drive off, and I told my brothers, who were 9 and 6, to do exactly as I said, without question. They nodded, and we walked towards the gate. I placed myself between the man and my brothers, making sure I got a good look at him. He was about 6 foot, dark brown hair, tattoo sleeve down his right arm, wearing a black skin-tight t-shirt and camo shorts. As we walked past him, I noticed something that made my heart skip. In his hand, closest to the school gate, was a pocket knife he was flicking in and out. At that point, priority 1 was to get my brother somewhere safe. I made them walk quickly in front of me to the library. I told them not to leave the library until I came back to get them. Then I made my way to the office through the staff room. My teacher, Mrs. Muddle, stopped me and tried to make me go back out in front of the school to the office. I looked at her and said, "There's a man in front of the school with a knife." She could see that I was dead serious and let me through. The office lady called the cops, who were quick to show up and arrest the guy. Lunchtime that same day, I was called into the principal's office. Before I could ask what I had done, I was always getting into trouble. I was pulled into a hug by some random lady who couldn't stop thanking me for saving her son's life. Turns out, the guy was the father of one of the students, who had been physically abusing the kid and his mother. When she decided to leave him and stop him from seeing his son, he decided that he would kidnap and kill the boy because he saw that if he couldn't have him, no one could.
My father passed away when I was 4, the summer before I started kindergarten. I don't remember very much about him, but the things I do remember chill me to the bone, and I've never spoken of these memories before. My father built custom motorcycles and owned his own vehicle repair shop that was attached to a small cafe in rural Saskatchewan, just off the American border. We all lived on a farm about 20 kilometers away from the shop. My father worked late hours, so my mother would tuck me into bed every night. I remember trying to stay awake in my bed every night, waiting for Daddy to come home so I could say goodnight. My toddler body wouldn't allow it, and no matter how hard I fought, I would always be asleep before long, but always to wake up bright and early to find Daddy in the kitchen, smiling with a warm hug. One night, I stayed awake long enough to hear Daddy's truck pull up and his door slam. I waited a little while in my bed, listening. I heard lots of banging noises coming from where the truck was parked. I was beginning to get impatient. I didn't want to fall asleep before Daddy came in. I got up out of bed and put my slippers on. I was determined to say goodnight to Daddy this time. I wrapped my housecoat around me and slowly made my way to the back door in the dark. I didn't want to wake Mommy up. I pulled open the door, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked through the grass towards the side of the house where Daddy's truck was parked. Daddy wasn't there. The tailgate was pulled down, and there was something dark dripping from the gate into the dirt below. As I was slowly moving my way closer, I heard the barn door slam shut. Forgetting about the dripping darkness, I ran to meet Daddy and tell him goodnight. When I made it to my father, about halfway between the house and the barn, I noticed that something wasn't right. Daddy had a funny look on his face, and his blue overalls were stained red. I looked at Daddy, but couldn't bring myself to say a word. I was suddenly very scared. Daddy picked me up, carried me into the house, and put me back in bed. He tucked me in and kissed me on the forehead, then left without a word. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night, and I heard a lot of very strange noises coming from outside. I never stayed up to say goodnight to my daddy again.
When I was a kid, around 8 years old, I took karate lessons at my local mini-mall. Just recalling the events of this story fills me with dread as to what could have happened. So yeah, I remember that my lessons were twice a week and an hour long, and my mom would drop me off and pick me up whenever it was over. Most parents would sit in the lobby and wait for their kid's lesson to be over, but my mom would always go shopping or something to kill the time instead. There was a guy that was in the lobby almost every time I had a lesson. He looked older, probably in his 50s, dark hair, long beard, and mustache. I always assumed that he was another one of the kids' parents, but I never saw him drop someone off or pick them up. Something was strange about this, but my 8-year-old brain didn't piece it together that it was weird that some guy would just hang out and watch kids in the lobby of a karate center. So one day I graduated up to a green belt, or yellow belt, or something, doesn't really matter, and my mom dropped me off at the same time that she always did. However, she didn't realize that I was in a different group of lessons now, and I wasn't able to participate in the class. So instead, I decided that I would look for her in the mini-mall. The guy started to follow me. He came right up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, told me that my mom told him to find me because my sister was in the hospital. He described what my mom looked like, what my sister looked like, and that I should get into his van so that he could take me to my parents. I remembered that I started to cry and followed him because I really believed him when he said that my sister was in the hospital. I asked him what happened, and he told me that there was a car accident. I asked him who he was, and I just remember he said something like he was friends with my mom. I remember that this didn't sit right with me because my mom never talked to him when she dropped me off, and I didn't recall them ever saying one word to each other. His van was parked a couple of stores down from the karate center by the sidewalk. I remember being something like 20 feet from the van when I looked behind me and saw my mom shopping through one of the windows in a JCPenney. At this point, the guy was holding my hand and leading me to his van. But I stopped when I saw my mom, and he started to pull me and said that we had to hurry. I remember pointing at my mom and saying to him, "My mom's right there." He gave me another tug, and I resisted and started to scream. He let go of me instantly, got into his van, and sped off in a hurry. In that moment, I realized that I was almost kidnapped. I remembered all the stranger danger warnings that were given in school, but I stupidly thought that because this guy could describe my mom and my sister, he must know them. Instead, he must have been watching me and my family for weeks before he decided to make his move. I remember running into the store, tears streaming down my face, and just giving my mom a huge hug. I tried to tell her what happened, but she just yelled at me and smacked me upside the head for missing my karate lesson. She took me back to the karate center. My sensei explained to her that my lessons were at a different time now that I have gone up a belt color. He probably explained this to my mom before, but as you can tell by reading this, I didn't have the most responsible parents. I tried telling my mom about the guy, who said he was her friend, but she ignored me. She said something like he must have thought I was another kid or something. God, my mom is such a fucking idiot. But I was too young to linger on it or do anything about it, so that memory just festered in me for years. And every year that went by, I became a little wiser and a little more terrified of what could have happened to me if I had gotten in that van.
Long story short, I haven't seen my mother in a very long time. Since I was maybe 13 or 14, and between being born and her disappearing forever, I didn't see her all that much based on the fact that she had very little interest in me or being a mom in general. I was younger when this happened. My grandmother got me into ghost stories, and so they didn't really scare me particularly. When I was maybe 7 or 8, I was used to my mom not really paying attention to me, and we resided in a house with her mother where I spent most of my days alone or with my grandma, who was literally insane. She'd buy me things and tell me how sorry my mother was for everything she'd done to me. It was bullshit. It was a dismal existence in that house, and it was my last full day before going back to where I was happy, my father's mother's house. Anyway, my mother looked like shit. She was heavy into cocaine, and she just looks at me. "Hey, you want to go see something cool?" I thought it was that day that her mom said would come, when she'd finally quit treating me like I didn't exist. I just nodded and followed her out to her car. We live in Colorado, and my mother was based in a little one-horse town in Washington State. She hadn't been in Colorado much. She'd come when I was 2 years old, I think. Needless to say, she didn't know Colorado very well. So we got in the car and we began driving. We drove past every single place that I knew, and I asked her where we were going. She didn't reply. We ended up in a tiny town, smaller than her hometown. All the buildings were old, and both the restaurant and bookstore we went into smelled musty. We spent some time in a used bookstore, where she immediately left me and went to her own section. She often just left me alone in public places, and had left me in them a few times, so I thought moms were just supposed to do that. I went to the kids' books, and after a while my mother came and found me and said, "Let's go." Thinking the adventure was over, I got into the car and thought nothing more of it. When I settled in the car and was ready to go over to my other grandmother's house already, she looked back at me and said we were going to that cool place she was talking about. I sat back and waited and watched out the window, and my mother stopped at a very old cemetery. I felt my small chest tighten as my mom got out of the car and looked at me expecting me to get out of the car. I did so, and like in the bookstore, she wandered off. The huge lot had all big tombstones all sticking out of the ground, so I wandered around for a while and all that. After probably an hour or so of wandering around the cemetery on my own, looking for my mother, she popped up out of nowhere and said she wanted my picture. She put me next to a random tombstone and snapped a picture with her camera she apparently kept in her purse. Most of my life I was terrified of my mother, and when she left when I was 13, she was taken away for something I don't really feel comfortable talking about. However, when I found out that something was actually off with her, and that she was considered as mentally gone as my grandmother, I can't help but think of what was going through her mind, and what possessed her to bring me to a cemetery in a town I'd never been to. Scary or not to you, it haunts me.
This is a story that I've heard from multiple members of my family. It didn't happen to me personally, but I have no reason not to believe what I've been told. I don't know the timeline or any details about the case, but I know that it's definitely true. I had an aunt who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and worked for some sort of agency helping convicted criminals rebuild their lives after getting out of jail. I don't know the name of the place she worked, but I know that they were involved in the employment of felons as well as lower criminals. My aunt worked directly with the clients, finding out all the kinds of things that they were qualified to do, what skills they might have, what they enjoyed, that kind of thing. She had a lot of experience talking to people who have done terrible things in their lives, but she never judged them for it or assumed that they would continue their criminality. The agency had to check the clients to see if they were genuinely interested in changing their lives, so most of them just really wanted help in becoming legitimate. She had one client who had a very hard time with transportation. He didn't live anywhere near a bus station and thus had a hard time getting to and from the agency as well as to any job. In the months that my aunt worked with this man, they became friendly, and at one point she offered to help him with transportation when she could. This is how she ended up picking him up and dropping him off at his house. I assume that whatever job they found for this guy was close to where my aunt worked, so she would just take him on her way home. She said that he was nice enough, kind of quiet and eccentric, but nothing too strange. At one point, when she dropped him off, he invited her in for a drink, but their professional relationship disallowed her from doing so. After a while, this guy apparently got on his feet and left the agency, fending for himself. My aunt pretty much forgot about it. After some period of time, I'm not sure how long, perhaps anywhere from a few months to a year or two, my aunt sees this guy's face on television. The police had stormed his house, I think after complaints from his neighbors, and found a horror show inside. He had murdered something like 7 girls and women and hid them beneath his floorboards. According to the forensics, his victims had been killed different times, ranging from very recent to before my aunt had known him. So basically, this guy was actively killing at the time she was driving him to and from his house.